All right, so this lecture is all about water. And you might think, how can you do a whole lecture on water? Well, if it weren't for water, well, I guess there wouldn't be any life on the planet. And since we're studying biology, which is the study of life, then water is a pretty important component of that. The lecture will be broken down into uh, why is water the element that allows life to exist on Earth? Why is that? Um, well, we'll talk about polarity, which is a property of water. Um, we'll talk about hydrogen bonding, which turns out to be incredibly important. We'll talk about some other properties such as cohesion, how water moderates temperature. We're lucky to be a certain distance from the sun so that water between 0 and 100, fortunately, does not freeze or boil, so we can live easily on this particular planet. We'll talk a little bit about life that lives under ice and why that's possible, and how water is a very good solvent. So on Earth, water exists in 3 possible states. Water is the substance that makes life possible on Earth. Life began in water. Some 3.8 billion years ago. So although life evolved on water, eventually organisms moved onto land. Did they leave the water behind? No, they brought the water with them. So terrestrial organisms are inextricably tied to water. Can any land organisms live entirely without water for the duration of their lives? No. For a short period, life forms may be dormant. They may have very little or no water, but they're dormant, and they won't start functioning again until they're hydrated. So the little epiphyal eggs, for example, of fairy shrimp or Daphnia, they're formed when water dries up from ponds. Then they can remain dormant. They can even be in the atmosphere for years, even up to 75 to 100 years. But they won't start functioning and hatching until they're supplied with water. So most cells are around, what, 70 to 95% water. Plants tend to have more water than animals. And water exists, interestingly, as ice, as a liquid, and as a vapor. And the interesting thing is, in some parts of the world where there's ice all the time, it exists in all 3 states at the same place at the same time. And that's because of water's particular properties. All living organisms require water more than any other substance. How much water is there on Earth? How much of the Earth is water?
70%?
Yeah, it's about 70%. 3/4 of the surface of the Earth is water. And that's why Earth is habitable. And if you get a chance, I don't exactly know where particular um, this particular documentary is, but Ian Stewart, who you may or may not know, is one of my favorite documentarists. He's a geologist, but he does have a documentary on water. He also has one on, I think, fire, earth, and wind. Yeah, so he's got one on water, which is very, very good. Well, this is the water molecule. Looks pretty simple. It looks pretty simple. Yeah, it's polar. What makes it polar? What does polar actually mean? Well, polar means that even if it's a protein, a cell, a molecule, one part of it is positive or even somewhat positive, and another part of it is negative or somewhat negative. Yeah, so that's what polar means. A lot of, yeah, uneven charge. So a lot of things are polar. All of your cells, for example, are polar. Yeah, so the polarity of water results in what's known as hydrogen bonding. So these charges here, the oxygen has a slightly negative charge, but it's not an ion. And the hydrogen has a slightly positive charge. Well, why is it slight? Why is it slight? Well, it turns out that water is highly electronegative. And electronegativity means the propensity to pull electrons toward itself. Oxygen is quite electronegative, and that's why cellular respiration works. That's why a glucose molecule can be oxidized because of oxygen, because oxygen pulls those electrons towards it. And even though there's a lot of steps along the way, that's the ultimate reason why glucose can be oxidized to provide you and me and everything energy. So oxygen is very, I know that's not a very technical term, electro and negative, pulling electrons toward it. That means that the electrons spend more time around the oxygen molecule here, the oxygen atom, I should say, sorry, the oxygen atom. They spend more time there than they do around the hydrogen. That's why the oxygen has a slight negative charge. And it's these partial charges that allow water molecules to hydrogen bond with other things, and in particular with itself. One thing you learn about water, it loves itself. Water loves itself. So they form hydrogen bonds with each other. Hydrogen bonds are always depicted as a dotted line. The reason for that is that individually they're not particularly strong. They're only strong collectively. Yeah. So water molecules' polarity and their propensity to make hydrogen bonds contribute to their properties, emergent properties. That's due to polarity and hydrogen bonding. So one of these properties is called cohesion. Cohesion. That's a bonding of a high percentage of molecules to neighboring molecules due to hydrogen bonding. Hydrogen bonds individually are fairly weak. They're about 1/20th as strong as covalent bonds. So that means they form and break with great frequency. But at any instant, a substantial portion of water molecules are hydrogen bonded to their neighbors, providing a lot of structure. water itself as a group is quite structured. Cohesion is one of those properties that helps pull water up through the microscopic vessels of plants. The vessels of plants, the phloem and xylem, they consist simply of cells that are stacked one on top of the other and have pores between them. So something like this. These are cells. And they just simply have pores between them. Very, 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 very narrow. So gravity, well, gravity is a pretty strong force. How is it that water goes up this enormous tree against gravity? Well, cohesion does play a role. Let's try something. So some of you at home have in your Petri dishes you can open those up. They're closed with a little tape. So be careful when you open these up because they have something inside them known as capillary tubes. They're glass, so be careful. She packaged them very nicely. You'll find 2 in there. And they're very, very, where's my thing? There it is. Very, 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 very small. So this is called a capillary tube, super narrow. And we're going to demonstrate something. We're going to demonstrate something known as capillary action. Take your dye and your Petri dish. I just took the lid here and put 2 drops of dye on the Petri dish. Make it 3. 3 drops of dye on the Petri dish. So go ahead and do that. If you were in the lab, Robin gave you a package, and the package will include the Petri dish and the dye. The next question is, what is the force that starts water going up the tree? It's quite interesting, and if I could show you this video, I would, but it doesn't really work on my computer or my iPad. So I'll just draw it here. So here's the trunk of the tree. I'll just make it quite simple. I'll just do 1 branch, and I'll just draw 1 leaf. And the leaf, I can't do that, can I? The leaf has what are known as stomata. So they're holes on the bottom of the leaf. And in this case, it's xylem. Those are the very small, just like your capillary tube. This is not to scale, of course. So those are going straight up here. And water is evaporating. Water evaporates from plants through the stomata. And as that water evaporates, it tugs on the water behind. So the water is being lifted with the other water up those very tiny vessels. And of course, where does it come from? It comes from the ground. And it's adhering, the water is adhering to the sides of the vessel also. And it's pulling the other molecules behind it. And yeah, there is some atmospheric pressure at the base. But most of the drive to pull water up that plant comes from the evaporation of water from the stomata. Capillary tubes. So here's another odd property of water called surface tension. Surface tension is a measure of how hard it is to break the surface of a liquid, and it is related to cohesion. So water has a greater surface tension than most other liquids. Why might that be, do you think? Why might that be?
Hydrogen bonds.
Hydrogen bonds, yes, yes. Because hydrogen bonds at the surface resist stretching or breaking. Because collectively those hydrogen bonds are very, very strong, and water loves itself, so it's going to hang on to other water molecules as much as it possibly can. It's kind of like a little invisible film. So this is a water strider here that's walking, literally walking on the water. And another reason why water is so important for life on Earth is that it moderates air temperature. It absorbs heat from air that's warmer, and it releases stored heat into air that is cooler. So it moderates our temperature. Where we live is the coastal western hemlock rainforest. Some parts of it are Douglas fir coastal forest. And you can see by this picture here, it's a very small person. These are very large trees. They do not lack water for growth. They're covered in moss, which is a good indicator that there is loads and loads of water in the atmosphere. And we live on the coast. And would you say that our temperature is quite moderate compared to the interior of BC?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, it's quite temperate. We're quite lucky here. So water can absorb heat and, interestingly, release heat with only a slight change in its own temperature. And so before I get into why that is, I need to talk a little bit about energy and heat and temperature. A few definitions. So kinetic energy is the energy of motion. Atoms and molecules have kinetic energy. They are always moving. It's a random molecular movement, sometimes called. Yeah. So matter has potential or stored energy. one matter can exist as a solid, liquid, or gas, depending on temperature and pressure of the environment. And each element has a very specific freezing point, a specific boiling point, melting point. So the faster something moves, the more kinetic energy it has. So heat is a measure of that kinetic energy. And temperature measures the intensity of that kinetic energy. Of the average kinetic energy of a substance. Can you read my writing okay? It's okay, okay. So this is very important for why water is able to moderate temperature. It's called specific heat. What is it? The specific heat of a substance is the amount of heat the substance, this is quite long, the substance must absorb for 1 gram of that substance to increase in temperature by 1 degree Celsius. On the Celsius scale, water freezes at 0, and it boils at 100. The specific heat of water is 1 calorie. It's water that's used to define a calorie. So water, compared to other things, water has a high specific heat. In other words, it takes quite a lot of energy to raise its temperature. It's really easy to raise the temperature of ethyl alcohol, for example. Very easy. But it takes a lot of energy to raise the temperature of water. A lot of metals, of course, have a lower specific heat. So if, for example, you put an iron pot, say, on the kettle or on the stove rather, and thank you, Katie. Um, you'll burn yourself on the iron vessel, but you could still put your hand in the water as it won't have heated up that much. Still lukewarm. So why is this significant? Why? Why indeed? Well, let's look at solids, liquids, and gases. There's an increase in kinetic energy from the solid. Solids don't move very much. Liquids move quite a bit, but not as much as gases. So kinetic energy increases with heat. So heat measures the total amount of kinetic energy due to molecular motion. Temperature measures the intensity of heat. The specific heat that must be absorbed or lost for 1 gram of a substance is 1 degree Celsius. So why does water-specific heat minimize temperature fluctuations that allow life to exist on Earth? Well, when hydrogen bonds break, heat is absorbed. And when hydrogen bonds form, heat is released. How is that significant? One is evaporation. So evaporation is the transformation of a substance from liquid to gas, and the heat of vaporization is the quantity of heat a liquid must absorb for 1 gram of it to be converted from a liquid to a gas. So what is evaporative cooling? Well, for a human, if you are running or doing exercise and you're very hot, you're hot because there's all kinds of chemical reactions going on in your body. All of the chemical reactions in your body have the byproduct of heat, so you're getting very hot, and you need to cool down. So how do you cool down? Say you're running a marathon. Well, your water starts to evaporate from the surface of your skin. And the water that's evaporating is your high energy, high kinetic energy water. And it's leaving behind the slower moving, less kinetic energy water that is cooler. And that is why you tend to cool. So evaporative cooling is as a liquid evaporates, the surface liquid behind that remains behind is cooler. Because the most energetic, the fastest moving molecules are likely to evaporate, leaving the lower kinetic energy molecules behind. So evaporative cooling moderates the temperature of people, of course, of animals. It also prevents lakes and ponds from overheating. Removes excess heat from skin, but also prevents lakes and ponds from overheating. Whatever lives in a lake and a pond their enzymes are adapted to function at the temperature of that lake or pond. Okay, let me pause that just for a sec. And the properties of water, which include its polarity. Let me just change that. Its polarity, which contributes to hydrogen bonding, which contributes to cohesion, which is the affinity for a molecule for itself, or molecules of the same type, and adhesion, which is an affinity of a molecule for another kind of molecule. And that specific heat of water is quite high. It's difficult to evaporate water. And when it does evaporate, it's got high kinetic energy and it leaves the cooler kinetic energy molecules behind, which is why temperatures are moderated on the coast. So you can add a lot of heat to water and the water will absorb it. It will absorb it without evaporating because of the hydrogen bonds. The hydrogen bonds will just break and form, but it won't evaporate until it's got quite a bit of energy input. So what's so important about ice? Well, ice is less dense than liquid water and it floats in liquid water. Why is that? The hydrogen bonds in ice, because they're solid, are more ordered than liquid water. So they form through hydrogen bonds static bonds between the molecules that don't tend to break. Whereas in liquid water, the bonds are breaking and forming at maybe 1 trillion times per second. So that's why water is liquid between 0 and 100 degrees. It's because the hydrogen bonds between those temperatures are just constantly breaking and forming. Whereas in cold temperatures, they remain static. So basically, the water molecules are locked in a crystalline lattice. And each one is bonded to a maximum of 4 partners. So as ice starts to melt, some hydrogen bonds break. And the molecules slip closer together. Just fitting the words in here. And until they get to be about 4 degrees where water is the most dense. So ice is about 10% less dense than water at 4 degrees Celsius. So then where is the ice relative to that 4-degree water? Is it on top or is it below? Let me put the chat up so you can answer that question. So ice is less dense than 4-degree water. Would you expect the ice to be above the 4-degree water or below the 4-degree water? So do less dense things float on top of more dense things? That's the question, really. Yes.
Would it?
So, sorry?
would it float? Or how
Yes,
about
so
yeah.
ice will float over the 4-degree water because the 4-degree water is denser. Exactly. So since ice floats in water, life can exist under the frozen surfaces of lakes and polar seas.
Maria, could you just go back to that slide, the previous slide for just a moment?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. That's all. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, no worries. So it turns out that 4 degrees Celsius water is the most dense water gets. So at 4 degrees, if it gets colder, then crystals start to form and the water becomes less dense. So when water cools below 4 degrees Celsius, it starts to form crystals and is thus less dense and rises. But when water warms over 4 degrees Celsius, then the molecules have more movement and are thus less dense and rise. So warm water is always on the top. If you go to a lake, warm water will be on the top, cold water will be on the bottom. Cold water is denser than warm water until it gets below 4 degrees Celsius. Then those crystals start to form and it starts to rise up. Why is that significant? Well, it's significant because that's why ice floats. If ice were on the bottom, well, that would wreak havoc for any organisms that would live in the water. So living under ice is pretty common. Seals in Antarctica live under ice. Shrimp live under ice. This is an example of ice fishing. So that happens back east. I haven't actually seen it myself, but apparently um, people put holes in the ice and then fish through the holes. Yeah, I mean, if ice sank, eventually all ponds and lakes and even the ocean would freeze solid. So, yeah. But what happens, which is interesting, is that the surface ice insulates the water underneath, preventing it from freezing. So the surface ice insulates liquid water below and prevents it from freezing. Therefore, allowing life to exist underneath that frozen surface. And that's very common. So we've seen that the properties of water allow it to move through very small tubes all the way up trees because of its cohesion. We've seen that it forms a surface tension on the surface of lakes, so some organisms can walk on the top. It's also very difficult to evaporate, so it tends to moderate temperatures by absorbing warm air before it itself warms up, and also by releasing warmth when it's colder outside. So one thing I wanted to tell you was about the fluctuation of water temperature. I have that written down here somewhere. The fluctuation of water temperature on the Earth is not that great. Like water temperatures change from, it's here somewhere, let me find it. Oh yeah, so okay, so the significance of the specific heat of water is such that humans, whose temperature must be 37 degrees, well, our temperature doesn't fluctuate that much because the specific heat of water is high. So it takes a lot of energy for that water to raise in temperature. So the other thing is, the other consequence is oceans don't vary much between minus 2 degrees Celsius and 35 degrees Celsius. So minus 2 to 35 or so in the oceans. On land, you can get fluctuations in temperature from minus 70 to plus 57 degrees Celsius. So much greater fluctuation. So life and water are bound to coexist together for that reason. The moon has no water. Temperatures on the moon range from minus 155 degrees Celsius to 135 degrees Celsius. So an enormous fluctuation with no water at all. So properties of water that allow life to exist on Earth. Well, it's a pretty good solvent too. Yeah, water is a versatile solvent due to its polarity. Forms aqueous solutions. Let's see what that looks like. So different regions of the water molecule interact with ionic compounds, and the ionic compounds are called solutes, and it dissolves them. So we don't need to do an experiment like that. I'm sure you've dissolved sugar in water and salt in water, and it dissociates. It dissolves. So water is a solvent, and in this case, the ions are the solute. The substance that is dissolved is the solute. Yeah. So why is that? It forms what's known as a hydration shell around other molecules. So in this case, we have chlorine here, and it's a negatively charged ion. And the positively charged parts of our water molecules, the hydrogen, are attracted to that negative charge. So they form a shell around that chloride, and that keeps it separate from the sodium. And the opposite is true of the positively charged sodium. But what's interesting is that water interacts with other polar molecules such as proteins, and that's really important because proteins need to fold in a very specific shape to be functional, and that shape that they fold into is due to being dissolved in water. So proteins are made of amino acids. Amino acids have different properties. Sometimes they're slightly polar, and as such, water can form a hydration shell around the protein. So proteins function in water by maintaining their shape and being dissolved due to their own polar regions. So the protein that's dissolved in the water and the ions that are dissolved in water are hydrophilic. A hydrophilic substance has an affinity for water. So they enter into charged interactions with water molecules. In this case, again, it's a negative ion here that's interacting with the positive hydrogen atoms on the water molecules. But a hydrophobic substance does not have an affinity for water because it's not polar or charged. So in a hydrophobic interaction, the hydrophobic molecules will migrate together. So bonds of a hydrophobic substance are nonpolar and non-ionic. So oils, for example, oils are largely carbon-carbon bonds, nonpolar, and carbon-hydrogen bonds, nonpolar. Why are they nonpolar? Because they equally share electrons. So since most biochemical reactions occur in water, it's important to learn to calculate the concentration of solutes in an aqueous solution. And we do that by measuring moles. A mole is the molecular weight of a substance in grams. It's the exact number of molecules of a substance in a given mass. So biology is really a wet chemistry. They're reactions of solutes that are dissolved in water. And chemical reactions depend on the collisions of molecules and therefore the number of molecules that are available. But we can't count. We can't count individual molecules. We just can't do it. Impossible. So molarity is the moles of solute per liters of solution. So to make 1 molar solution of sucrose, for example, we'd slowly add water to 342 grams of sucrose until the total volume was a liter and all of the sugar was dissolved. How do we get that 1 mole solution of sucrose? How do we get that 1 mole substance? What is sucrose anyway? Table sugar is C12, H22, O11. So how will we get a mole of sugar? Yeah, so what is the molecular weight of carbon? What is the molecular weight of carbon? 12. So if we have 12 carbon molecules, what will that molecular weight be? 12 times 12, right? And hydrogen is 1, right? So 1 times 22. And oxygen is, what is oxygen again?
16.
16. 16 times 11. Although I kind of thought that was 12 too. Let's put 12. What does that equal? Can someone do that calculation, please? 144 plus 12 plus 176 equals?
Sorry, it's not 170. It's not 176. I multiplied the oxygen by 11, not 12. So that would be 186, 192. So 144, 190 plus 12 plus 192.
And that equals?
Great question. 342.
342.
Nice.
Yeah. Good, good. So that's a way of measuring molarity. So 1 mole of sucrose is 342 grams, which is really just the molecular weight upscaled to grams. How many molecules are in those 342 grams of sucrose? How many molecules? Do you remember from chemistry?
.24 times 10 to the power of 23.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, that was 358. Because I did 16 times 11, not 12. So the total is 358.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, that's my bad. I wrote down 176.
Yeah, I was doing 176 as well because I did by 11. Sorry.
Yeah. My bad.
That's okay.
We're all good.
I'm pretty sure it's 012. It might be 011. I don't really know. Well, sucrose is either 011 or 012. I'm not sure. I always thought it was 012. So yeah, this many molecules.
Oh yeah, it is 11.
It is 11, isn't it? Okay.
Woohoo, back to 342.
Aha. Yes. Sorry about that. It is 011. Okay, so that's the number of molecules, otherwise known as Avogadro's number, which if one of those molecules was the size of popcorn, it would cover Canada to the depth of 9 kilometers. It's a lot of molecules. So what other significant things are there about water? Well, dissociation of water molecules leads to acidic and basic conditions, and that can affect living organisms because enzymes function at very specific levels of acidity. So water can dissociate. It can dissociate into hydronium ions and hydroxide ions. So these are hydronium ions. This is hydroxide ion. And also, of course, water can just simply dissociate in this way. It's a reversible reaction. Hydrogen ion plus hydroxyl. And this is actually very significant for chemical reactions in the body for synthesis and for hydrolysis. That reversible reaction. In pure water, 1 in 554 million molecules are dissociated. So it's rare for them to be dissociated. But that brings us to acids and bases. An acid is a substance that increases the hydrogen ion concentration of the solution. Hydrochloric acid is very strong. It dissociates immediately in water and causes it to become acidic. A base reduces the hydrogen ion concentration. Ammonia is a strong base. It takes up hydrogen very readily and becomes ammonium. The pH scale is the relative concentration of hydrogen ions. So here are some pH values of various solutions. Pure water, 7. Seawater tends to be basic. Rainwater tends to be acidic. Coffee is acidic. Tomato juice, vinegar, of course, beer, wine. Digestive juice is very acidic. Battery acid, super acidic. Things like ammonia, magnesia, bleach, those tend to be basic. And why is that important for living cells? Well, as I said, enzymes operate at very specific levels of pH. So most living cells have to remain at about pH 7. Therefore, there are buffers in the system. They minimize changes to the concentrations of hydrogen and hydroxide ions in a solution. So that's an acid-base pair that reversibly combines with hydrogen ions. So one really important one for us and for the ocean is carbonic acid. So carbonic acid is a weak acid. So it readily contributes hydrogen ions as a donor if a solution happens to be quite basic. It also, this is what it dissociates into, bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. So this is a weak acid, and this is the base. And if there happens to be a lot of hydrogen ions, then the base will accept those hydrogen ions and the solution will become less acidic. So it's driven by the relative amounts of hydrogen in a solution. So that is all I wanted to say today about water. I'm just going